And now over to Professor George Pagoulatos for his reactions to the scenarios and the Greek implications.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think we are indebted to Maria Rodriguez for allowing some clarity over the options we're facing and the situation in which we are in. Because by outlining these four scenarios, I think she has allowed us to see what exactly forms the only viable solution towards an exit. And that is a solution towards some version of what you have called, Maria, the completion scenario, which I agree, however, with Lucas that it is, under the political circumstances, rather utopian. Intergovernmentalism prevailing in France, reluctance to further sorts of transfer union prevailing in Germany, and reluctance to cede national autonomy over fiscal and economic policy prevailing in the South. It's a pretty nasty mix if you want to move towards fiscal and economic and political union. But you can have different versions at different degrees of the muddling through scenario, which I think is probably where we will be heading. And the big question is what the balance will be between the elements of fiscal union, the elements of joint and several liability, and the elements of joint control over fiscal and economic policy. And these different degrees can make a huge difference in the same sense that, in the same way that the particular policy mix and the different differing proportions over its different components have made a difference as to the adjustment programs that have been applied in the South. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me just say that viewing sort of in a very generic view your four scenarios, it seems to me that the core group scenario, where a smaller group moves forward and the non-Euros remain back, we're close to that, but the big difference in your scenario is that some members of the Eurozone also stay back and are not part of this tighter union. Now, this scenario is a scenario that clearly, as you've pointed out, exacerbates the differences and the divergences. So it practically leads to an unsustainable, economically and politically unsustainable situation in the periphery or in any other group of countries that is either decides or most probably is forced to be left back. So we are led into an unsustainable equilibrium, which at some point or another would give its place to the most abhorred scenario number 2. So it seems to me that both the core group scenario and the kind of muddling through your scenario number 1, under which the muddling through does not acquire a further ambition and does not acquire additional elements of a fiscal union and joint liability, these scenarios are not sustainable on the longer run and would end up being different paths towards disintegration that you've outlined as your number 2 scenario. And I think it is not, it's probably redundant for me to point out the disastrous effects of disintegration and the domino effects that an exit of even one country, one single country, would involve for the rest of the Eurozone. And it seems to me that at least these effects are quite clear in the minds of our policymakers. So they know what they want to avoid, they know what they would like to have, what they don't know is how to get there, to paraphrase President Juncker. Now, as Lucas has pointed out, the EMU architecture was a construction that defied the laws of gravity. So far, we have had adjustment programs in the periphery, which altogether, as a combined set of policies at a Eurozone level, have defied the laws of economics and are reaching a point when they are defying the laws of democratic politics as well. And I'll explain why. If you apply a number of austerity programs at the same time throughout the Eurozone, you will end up with what we now have. Eurozone as an economy sinking, the economies in the periphery incapable of exiting the recession through their exports, through export-led growth, because there's no demand for their exports, And all policies, and I'd like to stress this, all policies are restrictive at the same time. Normally, when you have adjustment programs, you apply fiscal consolidation, you apply a restrictive fiscal policy, you apply a restrictive incomes policy, but you allow some instrument to breathe, to allow the economy to breathe, to give oxygen to the economy, and that's usually monetary policy. What do we have in our case? We have, in the case of Greece, we have the most ambitious fiscal consolidation program that's ever been applied. The primary budget deficit reduction over 2 years had an average rate of primary budget deficit reduction of 4.1 percentage points of GDP. Look at any OECD country over the last few decades, you won't find such an intense fiscal consolidation. We've had an incomes policy which has been very restrictive. Now, these policies, to be fair, have delivered results. We started, as Lucas pointed out, we started from a point of extreme divergence, which made our survival in the Eurozone highly questionable. And we moved fast in order to catch up with the lost ground, in order to achieve the rebalancing in terms of fiscal sustainability and in terms of catch-up of competitiveness and reduction of unit labor costs and reduction of external deficits. And Greece has delivered impressive results over these areas. But the big question now is, what are the implications of this policy mix as to the public debt to GDP ratio, as to the prospects for recession in the real economy, and the prospects for unemployment, if and when this oxygen that I mentioned before is missing? Because what we have is the third instrument that would be able to partly offset the contractionary effects of fiscal policy and incomes policy, that is monetary policy, is not there. The ECB is applying a monetary policy that is expansionary at the Eurozone level, but the monetary policy that the peripherals are getting is not the same that the core countries or the AAA countries are getting. And the cost of capital, even for healthy businesses in the South, is many times that of their competitors in the North. So any competitive gains they achieve through reducing the unit labor costs and cutting wages, cutting the wage costs, is offset and cancelled by the large capital costs that they're suffering. And why is that? It is largely because of the convertibility risk, because the markets have somehow perceived that the periphery is in a high risk of exit. And there are huge responsibilities there on the part of the Eurozone for not doing as much as needed in order to dispel this fear. And as we talk, capitals are fleeing Spain and other countries in the periphery to the core, and this is not a balanced and sustainable monetary union. And the kind of backstop that the Eurozone has provided through its main Eurozone-level institutions apparently is not enough to dispel this fear. And the fact that this fear looms, this toxic cloud over the southern economies is looming, is cancelling the effects of an otherwise formidable and unprecedented adjustment effort. So if we do not have a change on that, a change of tack that would convince the markets and convince the media and the analysts that the Eurozone will move forward in its integrity, and this is not a statement that will have various caveats and footnotes attached to it, provided that, or under, or if, and when, or until for the next 6 months, and then we re-examine. If we don't have that, then the periphery will continue to sink, and as it is sinking, its recession will be reaching interwar proportions, and that's 1932 Germany, not 1923 Germany, and unemployment will be skyrocketing, and the public debt to GDP ratio will be becoming more and more unsustainable. Now, the second element that's missing is, of course, some instrument in order to offset the austerity policies that are inevitably, to a certain extent, being applied. And I mentioned monetary policy. There is also fiscal policy. We have seen none of that. There's no adjustment program at a time of recession that does not use some element of counter-cyclical not stimulus, but at least some support for unemployment. Structural funds have been rather inflexible in that extent, despite the fact that the absorption rate is above average in Greece. We would have used greater degrees of flexibility, and we would have used, the South, the periphery, would have benefited immensely from some equivalent of a Eurozone stabilization budget. It is a welcome event that the Eurozone leaders in the latest summit appear to converge over the need to do something about that. There is so far some degree of disagreement over what exactly that would be. Would it be something that would assist adjustment? Would it be something that would provide some support for jobs or some unemployment support? At least we are in a good direction there. But something more than what has already been stated needs to be done, and it needs to be done urgently, because the problem of unemployment in the South is explosive. And this brings me to the political, or rather before coming to the political issue, as I mentioned, the problem of unemployment, the other thing that we haven't seen is stimulus policies directed on investment through a reactivation of the European Investment Bank. Now, for months, there have been some developments that are welcome, but as the Minister said, they're not enough, they're too little and too late. The European Investment Bank has been acting as if it is a private bank concerned exclusively about its AAA status. They haven't been lending Greece for months because of the convertibility risk, in fear that they will be losing the AAA status. Now, I thought I was teaching my students that the European Investment Bank is an equivalent of a World Bank for Europe. My latest impression was that the World Bank is lending economies in Africa that are under civil war, is lending failed states, and it hasn't lost its AAA status. Now, if we have to get serious that the Eurozone is facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions of the magnitude and extent and intensity that appears every 70 or every 80 years, we cannot keep doing business as usual in these areas. And I come to the political non-viability, the defiance of the laws of democratic politics that I mentioned, that with such levels of unemployment, such as those that we see in Greece and Spain, it is no wonder that questions concerning that very core of democratic politics are entering the public agenda, and tendencies that we were hoping Europe had buried for good in the post-war era are resurfacing. In Spain, they take the form of secessionist tensions, and there is already a rise of extreme right-wing nationalistic terrorism and extreme left-wing threats to democratic stability. And in Greece, it has taken the nasty form of a resurgence of an extreme right, which is not just populist, it is far worse than any sort of extreme right party Europe has witnessed over the last few decades, certainly what Greece has witnessed. And this is, to a very significant extent, the result of the combined complacency of Greek governments and society over decades to deal with the problems of the economy in a timely manner when the Greek economy was still growing, and the greatest failure of Greece was not that it is now applying austerity policy under very adverse conditions. It is that it failed to apply the reforms and put its public debt in order at the time when the economy was growing with the highest Eurozone GDP growth rate per year, that is until 2008. And that is what looms upon us, and that is the failure whose cost and whose price we're now paying. But it is also a combined result of the Eurozone not being able to face up to this crisis in a way that goes beyond political business as usual, and in a way that is able to grasp the magnitude of the problem, because what we are now facing in the Eurozone is not just a matter of public debt. A problem of public debt can be solved, and we know how it is solved. It is solved either through growth, greater growth. The US solved this public debt problem through growing in the post-war decades. We're not having much of that in the Eurozone, by the way, and we're not bound to have that. And it's an aging society, Europe, with a large cost of welfare state and a large cost of cleaning up the environment. It is also solved by way of inflation. Arguably, the US is inflating its way out of the public debt. We're not seeing much of that. And Ralph Atkins, a few days ago in the Financial Times, mentioned that he would hope that the outright monetary transaction program of the ECB would be a covered way of quantitative easing, but unfortunately, this is probably not the case. We would, some higher tolerance to inflation or a lesser priority attached to a price stability objective of 2% would be highly welcome when the Eurozone is in such a condition. And many European leaders are converging towards that reality, or it gets out of this public debt problem through fiscal consolidation, but the limits of fiscal consolidation are really being reached in economies that are in steep recession, and of course more needs to be done towards the direction of widening the tax base and not just increasing the tax burden upon law-abiding taxpayers, as we have seen. Of course, greater degrees of tax consolidation will be negative for the growth prospects and will be disastrous and deleterious in terms of political viability of any government that imposes them. Or it is solved through financial repression, as Rogoff and Reinhardt have pointed out in a recent paper, through taxing the financial sector. And that would be a highly welcome prospect if implemented collectively. The financial transaction tax is a highly welcome prospect, especially if it translates into a new resource for a Eurozone budget. It would be welcome to see more initiatives in that direction, but at a universal and a collective supranational, not just European international level, or if everything fails, the public debt problem is resolved by way of default. And this is a solution that, especially for countries whose debt has grown to be an official debt, is unwelcome, because it will sour the relations with partners. It would make political coexistence in the euro quite toxic. It is unwelcome both for them and certainly for their creditors. But if you don't manage to solve the public debt problem by way of the other means, you would end up resorting to this final way of resolving it. And that would not be welcome again. It would add to the poisonous forces of disintegration in the Eurozone. But in order to avoid it, the Eurozone will have to get its act together. And I hope it does. Thank you.